Picture your favorite game of all time. Take that game and now think about the ability to play it forever. Only there's always something new. Infinite levels, situations, strategies. In theory, that sounds like a hell of a deal. It's something you'll see a lot in indie games these days. That idea of making a game with endless replayability. And that once impossible dream is now summed up in 2 words. Procedurally generated. Procedurally generated games consist of an algorithm that randomly and automatically takes massive amounts of data and creates the main chunk of the game for you, as in the levels or world. Art, music, gameplay, bosses, and design are still in the hands of the developer, but when it comes to the level design, that's where the algorithm takes over. From a technical standpoint, this is a highly advanced and impressive model with an ambitious philosophy. There's just one major snag. There's not a lot of games that employ this technique well. A well-designed game can teach a player what to do through gameplay. There's a level of artistry down to every aspect of a video game beyond just what you see or hear. That holds especially true in level design, which can make or break a game. Granted, every game is different, but most games typically have a rising line of progression for difficulty. Sometimes it spikes unexpectedly, either intentionally or unintentionally. The idea is that the player can learn how to play the game in the early stages while the later ones continually test that skill and understanding. Obstacles are placed in the way of a player as a way to both teach and challenge. These can be things like spikes, pits, enemies, seemingly anything that harms the player. When designing a level, a lot of aspects have to be considered, namely how a human being is going to play a game, their interpretation of what the goal they're attempting to accomplish, and what they can do to break your game. The thing is, no matter how much you attempt to compensate for it, an algorithm simply can't predict this. And that's where it becomes frustrating for a player. See, with procedurally generated games comes random number generation, or RNG. Typically, most games have some form of RNG, albeit so tiny to where you don't notice, or something small like weather condition. Essentially, it's like gambling, where you can't predict what numbers are going to get a hit, and therefore, nothing is totally certain. Sure, you can learn the system, figure out the best way to approach, and possibly make bank, but there's always a level of uncertainty with RNG in play, and thus, it feels more like luck than something that's well crafted. When playing a title built with procedural generation and RNG, playthroughs are referred to as runs. A good run means the player did well, either due to skill or the RNG generating a session easier than normal, be it to extra power-ups or shorter levels that allow the player to advance far or possibly finish the game. A bad run means the player likely didn't progress far, often with limited power-ups, losing health early, or dealing with swarms of overbearing enemies. Just like gambling, you can have an idea of how to play and what you're going to deal with, but it's down to the hand that you're dealt and how you can deal with it. But that's where the fallacy lies: how the player deals with said hand. Recall earlier, we talked about a finely tuned game teaches a player how to play through gameplay. Due to their nature, procedurally generated games will only have a tutorial that's created to teach you how to play, after which you're thrust into the main game. From there, it's off the rails. Difficulty can spike at a moment's notice. Hell, in some cases, you're done before you even get going. And since there's a lack of consistency, it's difficult for players to fully grasp on how a game plays without pouring hours into it with constant failure. Video games prey on a primal level of satisfaction, which is achieved through some form of progression. If the game you're playing is difficult, say like Cuphead, you can grind your teeth all day, and yes, while there is certainly elements of RNG in there as well, you at least know what to expect going in. The repeated attempts at finally cracking a code, so to speak, all feel worth it when you inch just a little further with every attempt. Playing a game that has elements so unpredictable, it's tiring to repeatedly fail and go back to the start. Speaking of which, that's what almost all these games do. Your run typically lasts for only a few lives or a small amount of health. This is especially true of games that also tout the roguelike moniker, which do make up a large portion of procedurally generated games. Players have to complete it with a tiny amount of backup, and once it's gone, you're done and back to square one. Just about every procedurally generated game, at least that I know of, keep your lives or health low enough that runs are kept short. But there's another trend with games that typically go this route, namely that they have unique and interesting concepts that don't exactly make for a long game. As cool as a dungeon crawler with Dance Dance Revolution controls is, there's not a lot to go with it for an extended period of time without the game growing stale or repetitive. Perhaps to mask this fact, these games have procedurally generated levels and a high level of difficulty. By no means is this calling a developer lazy, but rather it makes some sense from both a design and selling standpoint to write an algorithm that writes ever-changing stages. The only reason I even mention this possibility is these games also have typically yet another thing in common. When the RNG plays nice and you manage to have a decent run, you'll likely find that these games are pretty short in their nature. The unpredictability and high degree of difficulty plant the idea that the game is lengthy than what a single run would entail. And in many ways, that's actually the truth. But without the randomization of every layout, these titles could be conquered under an hour once players have become adept enough. Here's the final thought. Quality versus quantity. In a game where levels have been meticulously crafted, you'll always know what to expect. It is, for all intents and purposes, the safe bet. But with procedurally generated games, it's a wild card. You may hit jackpot, find a game you can fit into quickly, and adore, but you may also have to sink a lot of time into it, continually betting against the odds in hopes of hitting it big, and in many cases, just doesn't pay off in the end.